Hello and welcome to another edition of Consider This. My name is Mike Saunders, and once again it is my pleasure to be your host and moderator for today's discussion on fraud and identity theft during this Fraud Prevention Month. Identity theft, bogus investment opportunities, stolen credit card information, well, the list goes on and on. The Competition Bureau of Canada has named March as Fraud Prevention Month in order to educate Canadians about fraud. Here in the studio to discuss various aspects of the crime are Angela Book, Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology, Voula Marinos of the Department of Child and Youth Studies, and Teju Herath, Professor in Brock University's Goodman School of Business. First though, let's hear from Detective Sergeant Paul Spiridi, Head of the Niagara Regional Police Service's Central Fraud Unit. He's going to give us an overview of the most common types of fraud and the situation as it now stands here in the Niagara area.
Well, fraud covers a lot of different areas. It starts with identity theft. It's the most common right now. It's become a big problem between identity theft and identity fraud. It expands into debit card and credit card, payment card fraud, crimes against seniors, a lot of fraud against them, theft by power of attorney. Those are the big issues that we deal with, and of course all the internet type of scams. We see the same type of fraud that everybody else sees, so right across the board we see the identity fraud, the payment card frauds, mortgage frauds, theft by power of attorney. With Niagara having a high proportion of seniors, we're starting to see those numbers creep up. Theft by power of attorney and elder abuse is becoming a bigger and bigger problem, and will continue to be in Niagara as the population ages and Niagara becomes a destination for retirees. Well, in Niagara, fraud has become very, very organized. A lot of organized crime and organized groups are involved in fraud. A lot of those groups are concentrated in the Toronto and the GT area. So what we see down in Niagara are the results of their actions. They come into Niagara, whether it be payment card skimming, account takeovers, any of the bigger frauds, even some of the online scams. Are targeted here. We end up dealing with a lot of the victims, while the GTA services have to deal with the organized groups. We usually get the people that are coming down, so we get the members of the group, but not the full group when we're making our arrests.
And our thanks to Detective Sergeant Paul Spiridi, Head of the Niagara Regional Police Service's Central Fraud Unit, for that discussion. First we'll go around the table to get opening remarks from our in-studio guests, and then we'll open up the floor to the discussion at hand. First of all, Angela, among your research interests is psychopathy. So what can you pinpoint as the key characteristics, if indeed there are any, of a fraudster?
Well, as with any antisocial behavior, fraud would be easier to commit with psychopathic traits such as a lack of empathy, lack of remorse, a tendency to be manipulative, a tendency to exploit people around you and be parasitic. I mean, these all are things that we would think of when we think of a fraudster, right? So it makes sense to me, and in fact Bob Hare, who created the Psychopathy Checklist and is now working on studying psychopathy in the workplace, has said that these people who are responsible for frauds and large embezzling schemes and things like that are if they're not psychopaths, they're bloody close to it.
Now to Voula, your research focuses on the criminal justice system. So what are some of the measures, if indeed there are some, that could deter or punish those who commit fraud?
Well, the literature shows that there are two key aspects that are important. The first is one's perceived risk of getting caught, or the perceived risk of detection. And the second that follows from that is the perceived or the certainty that punishment will follow. And along with that is that there's a timeliness. In other words, that the consequence comes fairly directly from and close to a time period in which the offense was committed.
And finally, to Teju, we've heard about the number of papers you've written about internet fraud. You and I have had a discussion of it in the past, specifically phishing. Now, what is phishing and how would we recognize it?
Well, phishing is a type of fraud that comes to our email boxes, and email communication has become so prevalent. These spam emails basically seek some sensitive information from you, account numbers, username, passwords, and basically this is the type of spam email that we call phishing emails.
Okay, now let's open up the floor to our discussion. So how would we be able to spot a fraudster to begin with? Is there anything that, I guess, would tip us off that maybe we should be a little more aware than we normally would be?
Well, I think the Competition Bureau of Canada has actually, it's called the Little Black Book of Scams. And it's a guide to protection against fraud. And so I really like it because, first of all, it speaks to that kind of preventative approach. And it also has a list of myth busters. And so one of the things that can tip you off can be, you know, if someone is presenting a shortcut to making money, well, that's something that should alert you that, you know, shortcuts to attaining wealth don't exist. Or, you know, if you see a testimonials and being critical of websites and so on, you should look at it from a more critical eye. Never sending money or giving personal information over a quote-unquote secure website, right, is, I mean, a social insurance number, for instance, that's one thing you should never, ever be asked for, and therefore to provide. So, you know, there are certain key things that we need to educate people about so that they are aware when they have become a victim of fraud.
And I'm not very sure whether we can identify the fraudsters versus we can identify a fraud. Especially in cybercrime, we never see a fraudster.
Right.
So it's there are many cues we get, like you said in some of those points that, if it is kind of an email that's like really reaching you or trying to reward you way too much, if it's too good to be true, it's not true.
They also try to play on your tendency to be a nice person, right? So there's a lot of playing on that kind of thing. So playing on the tendency to think that people are honest and playing on the niceness card. So you don't want to hurt someone's feelings or something like that. Perhaps this wouldn't apply as much to the email type stuff, but when you are in person,
Right.
Someone might be very persistent and they might come back and say, well, but we've worked so long on this, why don't you want to put money into it? And you really haven't worked on it at all, and you didn't ask them to do any work, but they seem to make you feel bad for not wanting to continue with that. So just they do tend to exploit people's feelings.
And I think not especially in the phishing email, but there have been so many other types of email kind of frauds. We call them Nigerian frauds and so on. And many times we get these emails asking somebody has passed away and they need help, or somebody needs to be adopted and things like that. Again, that exactly goes to what you said. They are just trying to tap into you being nice. And, you know, initially, you know, when I started looking into these kind of emails and researching into this, I used to wonder who would reply to this kind of frauds, Nigerian fraud, you know, that somebody has passed away. But when you see some of these documentaries and video kind of stories, there are people who just, you know, give away. These are older people. Sometimes they are in their using their pension funds, and they give away their hard-earned, lifelong earned kind of things into this. And that's basically, you know, being nice. You know, they think that you're helping somebody, right? And most people tend to be trusting and they believe in others easily. Only the small portion of the, I guess, population tends to be skeptical and, you know, kind of questions everything around them. But actually in cybercrime, we call these as social engineering tactics, and it takes advantage of basically people's trusting tendencies, because people will give out information themselves, not thinking about this kind of other type of people that may be around them, right?
Well, oftentimes, I mean, we spend so much time on the internet, and you know, emails always appear to be legitimate, websites always appear to be legitimate, and it's often difficult to discern. And again, thinking that people for the most part are honest and approaching websites and emails in an honest way, we don't think that there could be, you know, an issue of deceit.
Well, what's the first thing we should do when we discover we've become a victim of fraud?
If it is a banking phishing email that you have responded to and you have given your account number and password to your online accounts, first thing is you're going to probably contact your bank to tell them that, well, freeze my accounts or deal with appropriately. There are also other alternative mechanisms, like you mentioned with the Canadian Anti-Fraud Center, where you need to report that there is this kind of email which they have responded to, so that they can take appropriate action, so that the phishing websites are shut down, so other people do not fall victim to that. That is a financial type of phishing email, but there are other types of phishing emails too that we have talked about earlier, or we have seen that go through organizations. They just simply seek your username and password, and the intent there is that once you have authorized access to somebody's account, which is basically authenticated way of using that system, well, that person then can do harm to much larger entities, or portraying that you're perhaps employee from that organization or user from that organization, you can carry out malicious activity. And most often what happens is you don't even realize that you have given out the information to wrong people. That's how the whole fraud thing works. But if you realize that you have given out this information, first and foremost thing is to contact authorities. So in this case, you probably would contact your IT help desk and tell them that, oh, I have given the username, password, and so on. So first and foremost thing is identify who is the next authoritative entity, and indicate to them that you have been victimized in this fraud. There are also provincial or national level authorities which can be contacted, so that these fraudsters are stopped in their actions. It's very important that we take our kind of responsible action as a citizen to even stop that from further going through.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on what you said, because really what you're suggesting is that a preventative approach is really quite important, you know, being responsible as a citizen, that you're not simply the victim, but that other potential victims are there. And so reporting it to, you know, the anti-fraud crime center and so on is important. But even within your workplace or among your friends and so on, letting people know that this is going on is a good way to prevent. So prevention is always the key, rather than putting the resources on the other end of the system, which is the criminal justice system. And at that point, it's I don't want to say it is too late, but you know, clearly it's better to prevent victimization.
I like what you said, like even just talking to your friends or letting the community nearby you, your kind of family and friends and your peers and workers around you, if you talk to them, it creates awareness. And you know, being the fraud month that this is, it's all about awareness, right? So even these small actions actually do help. And I think that recently there was a news article which reported a completely new kind of scam or fraud. So these scammers are calling and asking about going to particular phishing website to provide information. So it's now not coming through email, which was basically spam email or phishing email. They're actually calling you and portraying that they're calling from certain companies and asking you to go to particular website and provide this information. But you know, it's just that thing about these frauds, especially in the cyberspace, is that they are evolving continuously, and it's hard to keep up. It's just new way of how to deceive people every now and then. So we cannot stay on the same trend, but awareness is the key. Right.
Angela, is it possible, or is it even advisable to try to appeal to a fraudster? Is that something that we should even attempt to do?
Well, their empathy isn't strong, so it's not a terribly good strategy. They don't tend to think about other people's feelings. They don't even really think about the consequences of their actions in terms of themselves, so that could speak to why it's not a deterrent. they tend to be reward dominant, so they'll go towards the reward and not worry about the punishment. In terms of appealing to their humanity, if they are psychopathic, it's not going to work. They've tried actually instituting empathy in individuals who are in prison who are psychopathic, and it made them more likely to reoffend. So it did the opposite of what they were hoping, really. So that doesn't speak well to it. I have a phrase called callous empathy. They seem to know how people are feeling and use cues of vulnerability to their own advantage. One study we looked at whether they could judge victimizability just from watching people walk. And so these were 10 seconds at the most, each videotape, from behind, so you don't even see the face. And people higher on psychopathy were better able to pick out who had been victimized previously. And large correlations.
Well, that's interesting because although cybercrime is rampant, there have been some surveys in the last 5 or 6 years in Canada of businesses, and they reported that in fact most of the frauds that had occurred by individuals, not necessarily employees either, but by individuals. So I mean, clearly fraud happens in multiple ways, and obviously not all fraudsters are psychopaths either, right? It could be very small moments. They may have some characteristics.
Exactly.
That you're talking
It
about,
would be a safe bet to say they score higher than people who aren't fraudsters.
Right.
It's interesting to note so many cases of fraud, as we mentioned off the top of the program, go unreported today. Now, why would you not want to report it? And how important is it that you do report it?
Well, there was a recent survey of businesses, a sample of businesses across Canada, individual establishments, banking establishments, and insurance establishments. And what's interesting, as you said, is that so many instances of fraud do go unreported. The survey asked these establishments whether they had been victims of fraud in the last 12 months. And about half of them reported that they had. Half of that half reported that they did not report the fraud. And they provided various reasons for that. The first was the risk of jeopardizing their reputation, which is very important. Many thought that it was just the cost of doing business. Others believed that it was minimal financial deceit, so that they weren't going to bother reporting it to the police. So there are various reasons why people do not report frauds.
I think one of the problems is that most people who are honest assume that other people are honest. So there's a tendency to not look for deception all over the place. And it's interesting because people higher on psychopathy actually are the opposite. They're very suspicious and they just assume everyone's out to get them, so they're going to get them first. So it's a little bit embarrassing when one gets taken in by one of these schemes because maybe you shouldn't have been so gullible or and I shouldn't say the word gullible because it happens to a lot of people. I think that the assumption is that that other people will think you're gullible, and that's not necessarily the case.
So I think a lot of the problem is we're really trusting. We're perhaps too trusting of other people. And I wonder if part of it is the fact that we think, oh, it'll never happen to me. So it couldn't possibly happen to me. And yet it does. And that's the scary thing. Before you know it, it could happen to you with a moment's notice. How quickly, from the moment a fraudster gets a hold of your personal information, how quickly are they able to turn that around and use it to their advantage?
Well, In the cybercrime, it depends. Most often when they steal the financial information, they will lay low for a little while because they don't want to come on radar. And time again, it's been shown that after a little while, then they will judge a little bit. They will make smaller kind of purchases and they'll judge. But once they actually, there is a really large black market for this information because it comes easy. You really do not have to get into any kind of a physical environment to kind of earn money into this kind of fraudulent way. You can earn it in anonymity, in a kind of safe place from your home, from your computer. So well, there is certainly a big market, black market for this kind of financial information that is stolen. But once they get, once get the access to that particular information, can be even few seconds, and you will see there have been really interesting documentaries that were a series that was carried by MSNBC. Basically, they were catching identity thief and different types of cyber criminals. And in one of these documentaries, they showed how quickly they just completely cap your accounts or credit cards. Basically, it's used in few minutes. So yeah, it can be very quick, it can be very slow. It's just the tactic they use to kind of gauge.
So we all have to be more vigilant, I think, in taking care of our own identities and our personal information. As a rule, are we being vigilant? I hear almost every day about people who will use the proverbial 1, 2, 3, 4 password.
First and foremost is not to have 1, 2, 3, 4 as your password, like you mentioned. But in addition, even the banks, they are really working very hard to fight against these kind of crimes, and they do have multi-layer kind of protection. So you will see that when you get on the online account, you will go through the series of steps, not just simply one step. So the organizations also take kind of actions against this. As individuals, I would think that keeping your password safe, not sharing it with anybody. If somebody asks you your username, password on the email or on the phone, remember that organizations or banks, these kind of institutions are not likely to ask this information from you. So do not give out this information in any circumstances, especially if you have not initiated that contact. If somebody has called you, basically do not give. If you have initiated contact, then certainly you can have some faith or some trust in reaching the correct entity. Other thing is if checking our, statements, credit card and account statements, and many a times in this kind of a very busy life that we live, we don't even take time to just kind of go through our credit card statements. And actually most of these fraud centers, they suggest that you should check your credit, you should kind of review your statements on a regular basis, because that's where you're going to see instantaneously if your card has been stolen. And it can happen from anywhere, not just online, but it can happen from your convenience store or a petrol pump, gas station. So if you have lost that kind of information and you have been victimized to identity theft, there are other ways also you will identify that. So yeah, review your bank statements, check your credit report and so on. So those are few tips that are passed around.
And I would add to that, just always be suspicious of everything. Does that sound very cynical? It's horrible, really, but yeah.
No,
Just be
I think
cynical.
you're right, and that's what they say. Think before you act, and I think I have said this before too, many a times in earlier interviews. This is the first thing, that think before you act. Before you click on that link, well, think. But if you have clicked, before you put that username, password on that password website, think, right? So think before you act is a very important thing.
There is a minimum level of trust at some point that we enter into when we are using our cards and so on. But it's not simply about, fraud and cybercrime. I mean, fraud happens on a very
Everywhere.
daily basis, and
Yeah.
so we can't, although I take your point that we need to be preventative and we need to be suspicious and so on, these tips are meant to empower us, right? And so
Exactly.
knowledge is power,
power.
and so that's really the best that one can do.
But even if we feel like someone seems off to us,
Mhm.
we've been taught to be really polite
Mhm.
and not to say rude things and not to reject someone outright. We will say, no, not right now, or
Mhm.
no, because I have something else that I have to do, that kind of thing. And those kinds of things keep the conversation going with the person who's trying to take advantage of you.
Yeah.
And so you're keeping contact with them even though you really want them to go away. And the best thing to do in situations like that is, just a straight out no and keep going. Keep going.
Learn to say no.
Yes, without hesitation and without politeness. If someone isn't out to take advantage of you, they will understand that. But if they are, then they won't be able to take advantage of you.
Hmm.
So.
Okay, we're going to wrap up by going around the table and find out your final thoughts, your, as it were, takeaway message you would have on fraud from the point of view of your own particular research. And let's begin with Teju.
Well, if I have to summarize in perhaps one phrase, think before you act would be the thing that I would say. That would be basically more preventative. But if you fall victim, then also know what are the things you are supposed to do, or know the actions you can take to kind of safeguard yourself from further damage.
Okay, next to Voula.
Well, I think that it's important, first of all, to recognize whether or not you've been a victim of fraud. And so going on to various websites, such as the Canadian Competition Bureau or the Anti-Fraud Center website. So to recognize, first of all, whether or not you have been. But even if you're unsure, there's nothing wrong with picking up the phone and calling police and saying, this is what has happened. Can you investigate for me, or can you let me know whether or not I've been a victim of fraud? You need not be embarrassed. It happens to most people, and what's going to prevent it from happening continuously is letting others know. And really the first step in doing that is in reporting it to some authority so that members of the public are aware.
Okay, and finally to Angela.
My general message would be that you should be very suspicious, not in terms of everything around you, but if you see someone who's superficially charming and they seem to be wanting to get something out of you, you can assume that they probably do want to get something out of you. So just generally keeping aware of your surroundings and of how people are acting and paying attention to how you're feeling about interacting with that person. And if you are wanting to tell them no to whatever it is that they're asking you to invest in or give money to, just say no. Don't sugarcoat it. Don't try to be polite. Persistence is the mark of people who take advantage of people, and I suppose that's my take-home message.
Okay, and just before we wrap up, we're going to hear once again from Detective Sergeant Paul Spiridi, head of the Central Fraud Unit for the NRPS, and his final thoughts.
Each type of fraud is a little different, but for identity fraud being the biggest problem, if you start getting phone calls from collection agencies, or if you get a phone call from a credit card company or a financial institution that you don't deal with, inquiring about an account that you've opened, that's a telltale sign that you've got a problem. To combat it, the best way to minimize your risk of identity fraud is to check your credit history. We recommend you check your credit history at least once a year through Equifax and TransUnion Credit, and you look on there basically for any debt that's not attributed to you. The other thing you can do on your credit history is you can also see who's checking your credit history, who's doing the inquiries. So if you see some business that's checking your credit that you haven't dealt with, they can't do it without your written permission. So if there's a cell phone company that's checking your credit history that you don't deal with, give them a call and ask them the reason for the inquiry, because that's an early sign that your identity may have been breached. In the terms of identity fraud, is to file a report with the Niagara Regional Police or the police agency in your jurisdiction, and then start a running log. It's important to keep track of everybody you deal with, and then start contacting the businesses who have the fraudulent entries are in. So if you have a cell phone company that has an account in your name that you haven't dealt with, you'll have to contact them directly, explain to them that you're the victim of identity fraud, provide them with the police report, and have them close out that account. It's very important that people follow up to ensure those entries are removed from their credit history so it's not damaged going forward. Whatever way there is of making business legitimately, or people selling things, renting things legitimately, there's always going to be somebody out there trying to make a fast buck illegally. So what we're seeing is if somebody's selling a car on Kijiji or Auto Trader or something like that, legitimately there's going to be people that are trying to sell cars that they don't own, that don't exist. And what they're always trying to get you to do is to send money by an electronic transfer or a money service, making it very hard to trace. That's what they're doing. So they'll put up an ad for for a car. They'll try to get you to send money, or if you're even selling a car or have an apartment for rent or anything for sale, they'll contact you. They'll send you more money than you're asking for, using the excuse that they want you to ship it, and then to use their shipper. And of course, to pay for the shipping, they want you to send the money by a money service or by an electronic transfer. In 2010, the criminal code was amended to address fraud issues, especially in terms of identity fraud and money laundering. So that gave us new tools and new charges that we could use. So we're starting to see sentences increase with fraud as it becomes more and more prevalent, and as people realize the devastation that can be caused by an identity fraud. So we're seeing it go up, but again, you're taking into account what is unfortunately viewed as a non-violent crime versus other crimes that are out there. So you've got serious assaults, sexual assaults, you've got drug dealing, all those ones. And when you look in the paper and you see the sentences, a lot of people are even comment and question that they may not be stiff enough. So then when you go to fraud, the sentences may not even seem lower by those standards. But working in a day-to-day, we're seeing the sentences starting to move up a bit more, and they're recognizing the seriousness.
Okay, and we'd like to thank you all for being a part of our discussion on fraud and identity theft during this Fraud Prevention Month. For me, the common thread here is to use common sense and protect your information at every opportunity, and it's not as difficult as you might think. Our guests have been Angela Book, Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology, Voula Marinos, Criminologist in the Department of Child and Youth Studies at Brock, and Teju Herath, Professor at the Goodman School of Business at Brock. Thank you all for your time, and thank you for listening. That concludes our discussion on fraud and identity theft for this program.